Hey there, it's Chris from Good Roads. In the last video, we made an absolutely banging set of skateboard bushings, but we did it using a set of molds that had to be 3D printed, sanded, finished, assembled, and cast in 2 halves. Listen, I'm over the moon about how well this worked out, and I am so stoked to be able to cast my own bushings, but my ultimate goal here is to lower the barrier of entry so that you can too, and I think for you and me both, these are too complicated. So in this video, we're going to come from the other end of the spectrum as far as simplicity goes, and we're going to make something called a squish mold. This is probably the simplest kind of 2-part mold there is. There's no sprues or runners or anything like that. It's just a cavity and a lid. And it comes with a lot of advantages. There's a lot of cool, exciting things you can do with squish molds. So let's make one, and then I'll show you some fancy things. Here's what you're going to need for the project. A buck or master, i.e. the thing you are casting. I grabbed this barrel bushing out of my spare parts box, and it's going to work just fine. You're going to need some toothpicks or bamboo skewers, a drill, and a drill bit that's the same width as your toothpicks or skewers, some plastic cups, and one specifically that your bushing will fit inside, a hot glue gun, an X-Acto knife, and silicone for the mold and urethane for the bushings. As for those last 2 components, I'll have links to the ones that I'm using down below in the description. To start off, you're going to want to drill 3 holes in your bushing. I would call it sacrificial, but I don't actually think these pinholes will affect the bushing that much. You should still be able to use it after we're done with it here. Next, you want to push your toothpicks into the holes you drilled until they stick in place. Mine were looking a little gangly, so I trimmed them down until they were about ½ an inch long. You can also cut them to length beforehand. These are going to act like little table legs to hold our bushing up when we pour our silicone, so try to make them as even as possible so that the bushing is nice and level. Next, we're going to heat up the hot glue gun and put a dab of glue on the ends of each of the toothpicks. And we're going to glue our bushing toothpick assembly to the bottom of the plastic cup right in the center. Once the hot glue is cooled, we're ready to make our mold. Mix up a batch of silicone. I'm using Smooth On's Sorta Clear 37. Once your silicone is mixed, pour it into the plastic cup until your bushing is good and covered. You want a decent layer of silicone over the top of your bushing. Now, at this point, I'm going to start using my pressure pot. A pressure pot will give you better results both when it comes to pouring your silicone to make your molds and when it's time to cast your urethane when you get around to doing that. But you don't need to do it this way. You can make your mold and your bushings out in the open air, and they'll still work okay. They'll just have a bunch of bubbles in them. If you want to see more of how that goes down, check out this first video in the series where I cast and ride some bushings that I make without a pressure pot. Anyway, once your silicone is mixed, put your mold into the pressure pot, clamp it down tight, and pressurize. A couple hours later, when the silicone is cured, pull it back out and take a look. This is why pressure casting is so useful. That is a perfect, solid, bubble-free block of silicone. Next, we're going to break our mold free of the cup that we used to cast it, and after that, I cleaned up the edges of mine with an X-Acto. Now we're going to cut the parting line. Basically, we're separating the lid of our mold from the main body of the mold. And a translucent silicone is really helpful for this because you can see where your bushing is and see where you're cutting to. I'm aiming to have my parting line right here, right at the radius of the top of the bushing. I'm also going to try to cut my lid in a way that it's sort of conical so that when I pour my urethane, there's a cavity to hold a little extra. You'll see how that goes down in a little bit. Anyway, grab your X-Acto knife and start cutting your parting line. I'm making my cut wavy like this for something called registration. Registration is little details in a multiple part mold that make sure that the components of the mold stay aligned when you cast. As long as I have these little ridges lined up, my mold halves should go together correctly every time. As the cut gets deeper, I'm pulling the edges of the silicone apart. That way I can reach down into the bottom of the cut with my knife. Once you've cut your parting line all the way down to the bushing, all the way around your mold, you can pull out your toothpicks and globs of hot glue. They won't bond to the silicone, they should pull right out. The holes these leave behind will act as vents in the top of your mold, which will help release any air that gets trapped inside of it. I didn't really plan for it to happen that way, but it ends up working out really well. For the last cut, we need to separate the silicone that's in the middle of the bushing. So gently pull your mold halves apart and stretch that middle section until it's exposed. Then use your knife to slice it apart. Once that's done, you can pop your bushing out. And you're done! 2 halves of a squish mold. The ridges in mine all look really similar, so I wanted some markings to indicate which way the mold halves should be aligned. Initially I tried drawing the lines with permanent marker, but it didn't stick to the silicone, so eventually I cut little knocks in the sides of my mold. Even when I'm in a rush, I can look at those markings and know which way my mold halves go together. Great! Now that we have a mold, let's make some bushings. I mixed up a batch of urethane. I'm using specialty resins Flexit 80, and for color I'm using Smooth On's Ignite urethane pigments, which are their like neon ones. Links to all that stuff down below. Once the batch is mixed, we're going to pour it into our new mold. And this is how a squish mold works. You want to overfill the mold, which is why I wanted my parting line to be kind of conical. Put a little bit of urethane in the lid, and gently squish the 2 halves together. It doesn't take much force, just enough to get your mold halves to meet. At this point, if you're using a pressure pot, the mold goes into the pot and you wait for the urethane to cure. When it's done, depressurize the pot and pull out your mold. Crack that baby in 2, and pull off the little stems from where the toothpicks were. You can also pull off the flashing, which is this extra resin that gets in between the mold halves. Pop your bushing out of the mold and clean up any extra urethane that's left. And you're done! You've made a bushing! Just repeat the process for however many bushings you need. Okay, so earlier in the video I said that squish molds have a lot of advantages, and they do. They're easy to make, they're easy to use, and unlike the last set of molds I made, there's this big opening into the cavity that's going to eventually become your part. So instead of having the urethane go through sprues and runners and stuff like that, you can get right up in there. And that allows for all kinds of exciting customization. Let me show you. If you mix 2 separate batches of urethane using different colors, and carefully pour them into different sides of the mold, after the urethane is cured, you get a sick 2-color bushing. If you wanted to take that even further, again, you could mix 2 different batches of thane. And kind of pour them all over each other. Maybe give it a swirl. And after it's cured, you get this absolutely awesome swirl bushing. These things look freaking great, and you couldn't get these effects with any other kind of mold. And there are tons of other possibilities. Multicolor and swirls are just barely scratching the surface. So, I hope you enjoyed learning how to make this very easy style of mold and getting to see some of the awesome potential ways it can be used. It would be so very cool if this inspired some of you to go out there and cast some of your own parts, because ultimately that's my goal here. I want you to get out there and make boards. And, you know, parts for boards and stuff. If you got questions or comments, leave them for me down below. I enjoy the discussion. And if you like this video and want to see where we go from here, why don't you go ahead and subscribe? I'll give you a little heads up. The next video is going to involve 2 of my favorite things, color and science. As always, thank you for coming along on the journey. I'm so glad to have you. And until next time, I'll see you soon.